Hey Rebel Rouser, I'm Alan Boybot and this is Star Wars 7x7, your daily dose of Star Wars joy. And thank you so much for joining me for it. So this is, I believe, yeah, is that right? Episode 3636. 3636, how about that? And we are getting close to the 10th anniversary of the podcast. That's happening on July 7th. And so as I get close to the run-up, I've been pretty reflective over the last, few months as I've realized, yeah, this is actually happening. It's going to be daily for 10 years. And I thought I would share a little bit of a digression and consider what I've learned over the course of 10 years of Star Wars podcasting. So this is going to be a little bit of a different episode, and so will the next 6 episodes, basically. We're not going to do this in our typical format. And I'm just gonna talk. I'm not gonna stop and start like we usually do with the recording. So, the topic I wanted to talk about in this particular episode is the notion of trust, because I was reflecting back on how I started this podcast back in 2014, and I've talked about this on the podcast a couple of times since then, but just I initially thought of Star Wars as being like a public trust and said that it belongs to us as fans now. This is in July of 2014 when, just to set the scene, that Lucasfilm had already been sold to Disney, and we knew that a new movie was in development, The Force Awakens. We didn't know it was called The Force Awakens at that time, but we had seen the cast photo of the script read, and I think they had started filming by that point, but be that as it may. Yeah, I was pretty cocky in that belief, and the more that I've reconsidered that over time, the more I've realized how wrong that view was. And it is weird to realize that I started this podcast on such a backwards note in a way. But I am grateful that 10 years have brought me to a different conclusion, right? So it isn't that it's a public trust and that it necessarily belongs to the fans. I mean, our experience of it does belong to us, but ultimately we are giving our trust in the people who are stewards of this franchise. It had been Lucas for the longest time, and yes, there were a lot of years where a lot of people were unhappy with what George Lucas did with the prequels, and then have come around since then, and there are generations who grew up in the prequels who were very happy with what he did in the first place, and everything worked out fine. And when you see that kind of situation having developed, then it definitely puts you in a different perspective for what is going to happen with the sequel era, knowing that there have been some people who were really unhappy with the sequel era stuff, and there are some people who this is their first Star Wars and who are going to be shaped by it and will be fans for generations to come because of it. And yet I feel like there is a bit of a difference per se. For example, I, as a fan of Star Wars, was unhappy with the prequel trilogy back in the day, but I was also not of a certain stripe about it, basically, right? Yeah, I wasn't complaining about women or people of color or people under the LGBTQIA plus umbrella being in Star Wars, and granted, there were comparatively limited situations for that happening in the prequels, but it was definitely better than it was in the original trilogy, lesser than it is now with the stuff that's happening. But yeah, I didn't fall into that camp. I just fell into the, this is not working for me, basically. And now I feel entirely different. Stuff has grown on me, and I feel like that potential exists for people, for some people who haven't been fans necessarily of the sequel trilogy. But I also feel like there is a schism now between people who might be able to feel like that about the sequel trilogy and people who have just utterly gone their own way and rejected everything that's happening. And it isn't even really about Star Wars anymore. It's not that they're rejecting Star Wars, it's that they're rejecting the way that society is evolving, and it just happens that Star Wars is the avatar of that for some folks. So Yeah. So ultimately, what that has led me back to is that when it comes to trust in Star Wars, Kathleen Kennedy, as the president of Lucasfilm and as one of the most successful, film producers of all time, like, yeah, everybody's going to make mistakes, but that is a track record that you cannot argue with or ignore. And, The Force Awakens is the highest grossing movie at the domestic box office ever. I mean, she rebooted that franchise and she did it right. And yes, The Last Jedi and The Rise of Skywalker made less than those two, but same thing happened with the original trilogy, right? Empire and Jedi made less than the original Star Wars. Like, that's just the way things go, and you can't necessarily jump to conclusions as a result of that. Plus, you throw in, a global pandemic that hit, a couple months after the release of The Force Awakens or of The Rise of Skywalker. Yeah, kind of throws things for a loop. So ultimately, I've decided Star Wars is not a public trust. It is a trust in which Lucasfilm has, full faith and credit. And over the past, 10 years, what I've seen is that they are doing their level best to try to give us amazing and interesting Star Wars stories. And I fully trust that they are going to continue to do the best that they possibly can with this franchise in the next 10 years and on and on and on. So yeah, that's what my thoughts are about trust as it pertains to Star Wars and what I've learned over the course of 10 years of podcasting. And that is going to do it for this episode of the podcast. If you enjoy the show, I hope you'll help me get it out to more people, even as I approach this 10-year anniversary. There's still so many other people that don't yet know about the show. So please help me spread the word. And if you enjoy it, if you've enjoyed it for a day, a week, a month, a year, 10 years, please help me in the creation of it as well. You can learn more about that at patreon.com/SW7X7. And it just remains for me to say thank you so much for joining me for this episode. As always, may the Force be with you wherever in the world you may be.